By the turn of the century, the defeat of the American Indians was complete. The tribes no longer lived as they had just 50 years earlier. The land that had no fences was now sectioned off and sold. The tribes themselves were consolidated on reservations and told to give up their lives as hunters and gatherers and become farmers. Next, the federal government set out to Americanize the natives, starting with the children.
Stewart Indian School was a boarding school. They'd put you in the boarding school and you could not speak your language. You were punished for speaking your language. You were punished for following your own culture, everything that you were taught.
In 1890, the Carson Indian School opened on the outskirts of Carson City. It was later renamed the Stewart Indian School after Nevada's U.S. Senator William Stewart. It was one of several re-education centers set up by the federal government to teach English and white culture to American Indians. Attendance was not optional.
The children or their parents didn't know English, and so they were abducted, and they had no clue what was happening, where they were going. The parents would follow, and at some points in the school's history, the parents would camp out here by the school to be near their children.
Katie Frazier remembers being taken to Stewart Indian School when she was 8 years old.
I yelled loud when my mother left me there and walked out. I was yelling and crying and jumping around. Yet I got over that. And I couldn't talk English when I went there, and that was hard.
It was very military. They wore uniforms, they had to march, they were forbidden to speak their own language or practice any traditional practices. They were beaten if they did. The laws allowed the system at the time to beat them, and then a lot of times the children died, if not from the beatings, from the lack of medical attention because they were considered unclean.
Like so many of the changes forced upon them, the tribes made the best of the Stewart Indian School. Although they could attend Nevada public schools after World War II, many Indian students chose to attend Stewart. It was a place where they could learn and be together. But once the tribes had turned that tragedy into opportunity, the government closed the school in 1980. By the early 1900s, most of the remaining American Indian tribes were under government watch on reservations. In 1911, the last Indians who refused to live on a reservation were massacred in Humboldt County, Nevada. Shoshone Mike and about 12 of his extended family members were killed by a posse out of Elko. The band had been accused of killing 4 ranch hands, although there was no hard proof of that. Only 4 children survived the Little High Rock massacre.
The original idea was to try to convince all Indian people to go to these few select locations, but they refused to do so, quite rightfully. As they said, our ancestors are buried here in this soil. We don't want to leave. We don't want to go live someplace else in someone else's land and be away from our ancestors and our area. So basically they stayed in place, and there wasn't much the government could do about that.
Indian camps were common on the outskirts of cities and towns throughout northern Nevada, so rather than try to force them to move to reservations, the government set up a system of colonies, 10 to 20 acres under tribal authority on the edges of towns like Reno, Elko, and Carson City. Over the years, the reservation system turned into more of a child-parent relationship between the tribes and the federal government as the natives struggled with social issues such as poverty and substance abuse.
We're like babies in a sense because of the assimilation just within the last 2 generations. You know, our language is going. Our parents were forced to go to boarding schools. They were punished if they spoke their own language. So we're kind of the next generation to where we grew up learning English as the primary language. So there's a real desperate need right now to maintain that.